welcome back to the podcast that we're doing for Unit 4, Area Study 1. So we're focusing on health and human development in a global context. So it's a pretty interesting unit and I think you'll enjoy it. So sit back and chill out for a little bit and just listen. You can use this podcast as a means to get familiar with the content before we've gone through it in class, because sometimes we run out of time. We don't always have enough time for everything. And that's why I do these podcasts for you. Or hopefully you have done that already. If not, it's not too late. You can do it after some of the class content, or you can use it as a form of revision for your SAC and final examination. So in this podcast, we're just focusing on one key knowledge point for the moment. We're talking about, that is, implications for health and well-being of global trends, including climate change, conflict, and mass migration. So, and those key skills and what you'll learn by the end of the area is analysing the implications for health and well-being, in particular global trends. So by the end of it, you'll be able to analyse the similarities and differences in health status and burden of disease, and the factors that contribute to differences in health and well-being. So typically think of yourself and what things contribute to your health and well-being, and then think about someone else in another country, how perhaps because of climate change or rising sea levels or conflict from war or mass migration of refugees and asylum seekers, how would their health and what their experience contribute to their overall well-being, and perhaps how would theirs be different to our health status and our burden of disease, okay? So you need to start thinking in a global context, basically. But with this podcast, I'm not really going to go through any questions or answers. I'm sort of just getting you briefly familiar with the content. So in particular, we're focusing on climate change, conflict, and mass migration. But yeah, you need to think about particular factors of those that contribute to the differences or similarities in health and well-being. So for an example, let's look at rising sea levels, okay? So we're looking at rising sea levels. When this happens, people often have to relocate their homes. When doing that, this is what I want you to start thinking about. So I need you to start thinking about these factors like relocation of homes, or reduced access to fresh water, or what else? Farming, and how that has changed with global warming and reduction in agriculture and food supplies. So I'm specifically going to focus on, what one am I going to choose? All right, I'm going to choose reduced access to fresh water. Now, you will be getting a table in class when we're doing our climate change lesson that goes into more detail, but I just want you to start thinking how reduced access to fresh water would impact your health and well-being. So in the table, you actually describe it. So I'll read out to you the description I have. As sea levels increase, salt water eventually seeps into freshwater sources. Humans cannot drink salt water, and many plants cannot survive high levels of salt. Often, countries that are subjected to the effects of rising sea levels are classified as lower income countries, which we will talk about and have spoken of, and cannot afford desalination plants to remove the salt from the water. Okay, so that's the description of it, but how does that impact your health status and burden of disease? Okay, so start thinking about answers like this. Reduced access to fresh water can result in higher rates of morbidity and mortality from diarrhea and other waterborne diseases, as people struggle to reuse the limited water they might have available. Water scarcity may also lead to increased levels of poverty, as people may have to pay large amounts of money to purchase clean drinking water. This can impact the mental and emotional health of individuals due to increased stress. Physical health and well-being can also be affected, as families may not have enough money to purchase food, shelter, clothing, and healthcare services. So that's a good answer, but what else could be a contributing factor? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, but there's something in particular that I'm thinking of. So for people that have had to relocate where they're living. So, sorry, just to reiterate, this whole question was about rising sea levels and people having to relocate their home and having reduced access to fresh water, okay? So say children have to walk 2 hours a day to get fresh water, and that means that they're missing out on 2 hours of school. How would not being able to get those 2 hours of education impact their health status compared to you at home that doesn't have to worry about having to go walk for water, that can just go to the tap at home and get it? Okay, so these are the kind of things I want you to start thinking about when we dive into the content a bit more in class. It'll start making a little bit more sense. But yeah, I just want you to start thinking about similarities and differences between yourself and someone overseas that could possibly be subjected to the impacts of climate change more than what you are at home, okay? So now we'll move on to conflict and mass migration. We're quite lucky in Australia because, yes, we have conflict, but we don't have conflict due to war. So think about this, like, conflict has a massive impact on health and well-being. I guess besides the obvious loss of life that occurs during conflict, other things happen, such as poor living conditions, poor physical health and well-being, the physical environment being destroyed, food and water sources, such a lack of fresh food and water sources, access to healthcare being limited, malnutrition because people can't access good food and good water, an increase in injuries and infections, diseases caused by unsafe water. There are higher rates of maternal and infant mortality. There are more outbreaks of communicable diseases. Women are at high risk of rape and abuse when conflict occurs. There also can be long-lasting effects, such as the presence of landmines once the conflict is over. So think about those things that I've listed, or factors, contributing factors, from conflict that is impacting health status and burden of disease from someone living in those conditions, and how is that different to yours? So you need to start thinking, well, which one will I choose? Okay, women are at high risk of rape and abuse when conflict occurs. Obviously, that is going to stress women out a lot, affecting their mental health. Perhaps if it does happen to them, unfortunately, and that means that their physical health has been affected. They may have a chance of contracting sexually transmitted diseases, things like that. You need to start telling me how these factors contribute to health status and burden of disease, which you should be familiar with those two terms, health status and burden of disease, because we have spoken about them earlier in the year. And then we have mass migration. So when conflict occurs, there's a mass migration of people who are either seeking refuge in another country or who are displaced within their own country, and that can be known as internally displaced people. So when I'm talking about mass migration, it refers to the movement of large groups of people, and with that comes diseases are more prone and easily contracted. There often is a lot of overcrowding in urban centres. Like I said before, the spread of infectious disease is more prevalent. There is more stress placed on healthcare systems of countries that are already struggling to meet the health needs of the population. So these are contributing factors that impact on health and well-being. People can suffer from insecurity, lack of health services, shortages of food and water, similar to what I was saying with climate change. Displaced women and children are particularly at risk of sexual and gender-based violence. There are increased levels of domestic violence. There is more child abuse. There can be more alcohol-related violence. Refugees are often forced into crowded and unsanitary living conditions in refugee camps. So say a family is in a refugee camp and they are facing unsanitary living conditions. How's that going to impact their overall health status and burden of disease? And that's due to mass migration. So I guess they are more likely to contract diseases that we at home living in sanitary conditions are not going to contract. And also we're more educated about it. So you need to start thinking about these factors that are contributing to the difference in health status and burden of disease globally, okay? And how am I going to end this podcast off? So like every sort of new chapter we start, I've got chapter questions for you. But yeah, I just wanted you to listen to this podcast, start getting familiar with a few terms that we'll be talking about in class. But don't worry, because we will be delving into this in more detail. We'll be doing activities. We're not necessarily just going to be sitting down. You're not just necessarily going to be listening to me at the front of the room. We're going to be doing engaging activities where you have a bit more of a choice in how you want to participate in it. So I look forward to seeing you all next week, and we'll start the new unit, and let's enjoy it and focus on that key knowledge point of implications for health and well-being of global trends, and that's focusing on climate change, conflict, and mass migration. All right, see you in class.